The only thing you can get right is be true to yourself, and your, protecting your energy, setting boundaries, anchoring yourself to your purpose. What's your legacy? What are you trying to build here? So the only way that I can get this right is if I focus on myself and how I want to show up. If I'm trying to second guess what other people expect, it's never going to work.
On today's Leadership Disrupted podcast, we're joined by Cecilia Anderson. And Cecilia, as you know, the ultimate premise of this podcast is that the world of leadership is changing because our world is changing. Technology-driven change, cultural-driven change, generational change, the pace of work, the complexity of work, and all the other changes, lots and lots of changes. And so old leadership playbooks, old leadership styles, really almost, you can look pre-pandemic and you can just see the way leadership tended to arrive in the workplace. We're seeing the impact of that leadership model erode, and yet a new model isn't necessarily rising up. And so I love talking to leaders like yourself, people who have broad exposure to a large range of workplaces, a large range of employees and leaders in the workplace. And I'm really looking forward to this because I think your point of view is informed by the world, by this new world that we live in. And so with that said, let me introduce you to our podcast audience. Cecilia Anderson is number one, a trainer. She does facilitate corporate training, both virtually and on-site throughout the world, particularly on the European continent, but really throughout the world. In addition, though, and probably more importantly, she is a thought leader. She is a strategist. She is someone who develops learning solutions. And I've seen Cecilia working in the real world, doing real work. And what is amazing to me, she and I were in Munich together, and she asks great questions when she's engaging with a client. She has this ability to pull out from clients things that even they aren't necessarily aware of, to help them develop custom training solutions that really target what they're looking to target. Because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And it helps to have someone like Cecilia with broader points of view, a broader perspective, to draw out from a client exactly what's going to work for them in developing solutions for them. So Cecilia also just happens to be a really cool person. And so you add all of those things, the competencies, the coolness, the friendliness, and do you speak 2 or 3 languages, Cecilia?
Just two.
Oh, just 2. Okay, I'm still working to master my one language, the English language. So Cecilia is bilingual and global in her perspective. So with that, Cecilia, is there anything that I should, or that we should share with the audience first in terms of just an introduction to who you are before we roll up our sleeves and kind of dig into the conversation?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast, Dan. I'm really, really excited to be talking to you. I love our conversations, so it would be great for people to also be part of this. So thank you. And what a great intro. I think I'm blushing already from hearing all the great things you said. So about my trajectory, I am all those things that you said. Well, maybe not cool, but definitely a trainer. And I'm very privileged because I get to spend a lot of time with leaders around Europe and beyond. And I hear the challenges, and I know the world is changing a lot. And even from my first steps into leadership a very long time ago, I've changed, I've evolved, and I'm still discovering new things. And that's the great thing about the work that we do. We know change happens in small increments, and we are part of their journey. So I'm very, very lucky to be helping, guiding, supporting, and learning from the leaders that I spend time with. So really honored to be here sharing all those insights that I've collected from mostly from my trips. So yes, thank you.
Excellent. So let's start at the high level, 30,000 feet, and then we'll go, deeper and deeper and deeper. But from a broad perspective, um, now I still view your age, you're a relatively young woman compared to me. I'm more of the grizzled old dog. But you've been around, enough to have seen the transitions over the last couple of decades. Um, how would you characterize the transition in the workplace, like the mindset of employees, the mindset of workers? Um, how would you describe the shifts that you've observed?
Yes, I'm even reflecting on my own journey, and this is something that I like to share when I'm delivering sessions for leaders. We all learn from our mistakes, and we all learn from the things that we wish we'd done differently. And when I think back to maybe 20 years ago, when I was starting to lead teams, I was very young myself, and I was trying to figure out what a good leader should be like. And and sometimes we get in our heads and we try to second guess what other people expect from a leader. And we end up losing ourselves a little bit in the process. And I think one of the great things that I've seen in the last few years is that we are going towards authenticity and vulnerability, and maybe mastering more emotional intelligence rather than just pretending that everything's fine, and that because we're leaders, we're not affected by the same challenges that other people have, not just our team members, but also as humans. So that shift is something that I've noticed in myself, that I've allowed myself to be more me in the workplace, and I've seen this in other people as well. And whenever I talk about this in my sessions, I get people at the end of the workshop saying, "Oh, I'm really glad you shared your stories, because now I don't feel like it's just me going through this, and I don't feel that it's a challenge that only I face." So I think that's one of the biggest shifts that I've seen in the last 15 to 20 years, I would say.
I think so much people want to bring their authentic selves to the workplace, but they're waiting for the permission. They're waiting for the signs that it's okay. And leaders, maybe unconsciously, sometimes project that it's not okay. In fact, oftentimes, the way a leader presents themselves in the workplace, um, the way he or she shows up tends to, maybe not intentionally, but tends to send out signals. This is how you're expected to be. This is how you're expected to dress. This is how you're expected to communicate. This is the level of humor that's okay. This is the level of seriousness that's required. All of these things. I mean, I think maybe this is natural in terms of how we're built. Our first instinct is to align with the leader unless the leader gives us permission to say, you don't need to be me. In fact, I don't want you to be me. If you're me, then one of us is irrelevant. I need you to be you. I hired you to be you. But that's not something that will necessarily come naturally from people until a leader actually communicates those words, those intentions, and not just once. Sometimes leaders have a habit of saying to themselves, well, I told them to be authentic. I told them once to open up, to share the bad news with me, to share what things are not working, as well as the things that are working. But I think uh, probably one of the big leadership communications lessons I've learned over the years is, if it's important as a leader, you need to communicate it consistently multiple times, and then eventually people will believe that it is in fact an important message for you. Um, Have you, in the last few years, seen any particular, what I'll call leadership missteps? You don't necessarily have to name names, but you can, share, thoughts or examples of how leaders, perhaps unintentionally, have made missteps as they're trying to lead in this new world.
Yes, I have many examples, and every time I'm doing a session, I think of my own and other people's. And sometimes it's about the delivery, sometimes it's about, I think something that's really important is that we, as leaders, we can, our energy can be contagious in a good and in a bad way. And I think it's great to say the right things, but if you're not really living up to your values and embodying them with, with your actions and your behavior, it's just an empty message. So I've seen lots of leaders who claim they are many things, but then in reality, they behave in a very different way. And your team is looking up to you and forming themselves as future leaders based on what they see and what they experience. So behavior is going to be very important. And I think this is particularly noticeable when you work in a face-to-face environment. I think those of us who work remotely can sometimes, be our best selves for a 1 hour call. But when you're in an office all day and you are faced with challenges, how do you respond to those challenges? Are you doing what you say you expect other people to do, or are you managing your own emotions and feelings? So this is something that I've seen a lot in my experience. Another challenge that I see many leaders have, and this is a topic of conversation, especially for the people who are moving from individual contributors to being leaders, is the challenge with delegation and being really clear and supportive in this task, and being able to relinquish control. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that people find. I find this challenging myself, and it's something that even at home, sometimes when I delegate tasks, I always feel that it's easy to do it myself, but we have to really empower other people to develop those skills. We have to free up space for ourselves to complete our tasks. So it's super important. And I know it's a really basic leadership skill, but still people need a lot of help with that, from my experience working with leaders. And going back to authenticity and what we were talking about before, again, I think it's a cultural thing. I think I'm really privileged to work in Europe, where it's more of a flat structure and people can really communicate more openly. I think in some other cultures, there are still models that are more valid. So I'm bringing more of a, despite working with other parts of the world, I think the outlook that I bring is mostly based on my experience working around Europe. So yeah.
Even in Europe, even in the most open environments, and I'll go to what I perceive to be the extreme in terms of openness. I'll go to the Scandinavian countries like Norway, Finland, to some degree. There is still always a story under the story. There's still always something to observe under the surface. And I love it when someone says to me, I'll meet someone and they will say, I'm a total open book. There's no need to analyze me. I'm an open book. I just am what I am. I say what I mean. Almost always what my ear hears is someone saying, please don't analyze me. Please don't look too closely. Please just accept my surface for what it is. And in almost every case, all that really does is it causes my awareness to go up, to go, okay, let's see if you really are just out on the surface. And almost always, and I don't mean this as a criticism, I mean it as an observation, that when someone starts by saying, I'm an open book, there's nothing here, nothing to see here other than what's on the surface, probably not exactly true. Now, they may not be aware of how much there is under the surface. And then, of course, there are other cultures where there are layers and layers and layers of protection. In now, what you just said, there's so much to unpack there. And let's start with, you said that employees notice, perhaps more so in an on-site environment. I think it's easier. You're right. It's easier in a virtual environment. You can look at me and I can control what you see below the waist, and I can control what you see on the screen, and I can control the time. So I can have a great deal of control over this communication. But what ends up happening is then people pay even more attention to the nuances. People do pay attention to the energy that you're bringing. They pay more attention to your gestures. They pay more attention to your background, right or wrong, fair or not. They pay attention to all of those details. And then on site, what many leaders don't recognize is how much they are under the microscope. People pay attention to your tone of voice. They pay attention to who you're talking to, who you're laughing with, who you share a joke with, who you assign a project to, who you don't assign a project to. And so when it comes to delegation, people notice, who do you delegate to, which is really is an indicator of who do you trust. And then they notice, how do you treat those to whom you delegate projects? And then how do you manage that delegation? Because oftentimes how you manage that delegation, again, indicates your degree of trust or your degree of paranoia or distrust or whatever. And I think leaders, particularly emerging leaders, have to get used to the fact that they are always under the microscope now. In the past, they may have been able to simply do what they do, be what they are. As long as they produce, as long as they're high performing, they get credit, and then ultimately they get elevated. But once you get elevated to this point where you have even a small amount of influence or power over the careers of others, that microscope starts to increase in power. People do start to notice, how do you communicate? And they start to, there's some interesting research that shows, even when it comes to manner of dress, there was a research done where they had the leader of a team change his manner of dress, go from open collar shirts to button down. And over the course of 3 months, the men in the group over time drifted toward or evolved toward wearing more button-down shirts versus open collar shirts. And they've done similar experiments with women leaders and the degree of ornamentation or jewelry or just the manner of dress. Even one part of that experiment was the leader transitioned from having a very high-end watch to a low-end watch. And sure enough, that transition occurred over 3 to 4 months. Also the reverse. So we see that even at these very subconscious levels, I don't know if people are consciously saying, "Oh, the leader, carries a Mont Blanc in his shirt pocket, so I'm going to start wearing a Mont Blanc in my shirt pocket." It
Well,
may not
dress
be
for the job
conscious.
you want, right?
Yeah, but it happens. It's a signal that's being sent out. And then you mentioned varying cultures, some more toward command and control, some a little more democratic. Part of that is cultural, part of that is personal. And I think we all, when we first start leading others, we tend to assume, well, you selected me as a leader, so I must be the model. And so I'm going to assume others will operate the way I operate. And it takes a fair amount of time and maturity for a leader to realize the job isn't for everyone to become you. The job is for you to get the most out of everyone who's operating independently, operating authentically. That's a much more challenging job. But I think that's a part of this shift, this trend that we're seeing in the workplace. It's not treating everyone as a cog in the machine, and your job is just to oil the cogs to keep them spinning quickly. The job is to see that every person brings unique elements to the workplace. And I'd love to hear more about your perspective on this. I think it's particularly true of the younger generations. but it's true of all of us, but particularly the younger generations. They want to be seen. They want you to, they want to know that you know them and that you're okay with them, and whatever they bring, as long as it's not something that's getting in the way of getting the job done, they want to be able to be themselves. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll ask you to share, is I had a leader who said to me, because he's about my age, so he's been around a long time. And he said, when I think back to what the workforce looked like in the 80s and the 90s, they dressed the same. They acted the same. They were good soldiers. He said, in fact, in the 80s, we had a dress code. We had a dress code for men and women, and it was a fairly narrow dress code in terms of what color of slacks were appropriate, what color of suit or blazers was appropriate, what kind of ties were appropriate for men, and then the same for women. It was quite rigid. And then he said we moved toward first, um, uh, what was it? It was Fridays. It was not relaxed Fridays, but it was
Rest down Fridays.
casual Fridays. And then he said over time, casual Fridays seeped into Thursdays and Wednesdays and Tuesdays. And he said, I look at our workforce now and they're so different and individualized. And he said, the smarter part of me knows it's good, but there's an instinctive part of me that wishes I still had an army. That I wish I had, good soldiers showing up, looking the same way, acting the same way, saluting when I say, "Hey, we need to get this done by Thursday at 5:30." Now, instead of people saluting, I have people explaining to me how the systems won't support that, how the workflow won't support that, or how to do that, I have to give up something else. Yeah, yes, we can do this, but we have to make some hard choices because this will mean something else has to be delayed. And he said, I think in the past, those choices still need to be made, but people were scrambling so that I thought things would just happen. I would say jump. People would say how high, and they would jump as high as I needed them to be. And now they're more comfortable being authentic with me. And he said, the smarter part of me knows it's good. I know it's good, but I still kind of wish I had good soldiers. So does that prompt any thoughts?
Well, I've got a few things that, I was making a list in my mind. So going back to people being observed and as leaders, they don't just watch, how much time you spend with people. Who do you go on meetings with? Who do you go on breaks with? Who do you have a coffee with? All those things are being watched, and people might feel excluded, which, is something that we have to be mindful of as leaders. If you spend too much time with someone, you could be accused of favoritism. So there's that to keep in mind. But I wanted to bring it back to the dress code, and I know it's controversial. And I've got three things. So one was the optics, the other one was dress code, and then
I
we'll go
love
to
it when you pause because
the
I can see you're thinking, okay, how far do I go with this? An is great. So we'll see how far you're willing to
I can
go.
go very far. So in terms of the dress code, I think, yes, there was more of an office attire back in the day. And that's evolved quite a lot, especially post pandemic. People relaxed in how they dress. And I say it's controversial because this is the conversation I had with many people. I think the way you dress affects your mindset. At least it does for me. So I feel that even if I work virtually, if I was working in my gym clothes, my brain would be sending a signal saying, "You're not just working, are you? You're chilling a little bit." So I know some people can work with pajama bottoms, for example, and that's absolutely fine. But I think the way you dress also sends a message, and it sends a message about your own perception of yourself, how much care you take about your appearance, and how much you value the work that you're doing as well. I'm also very conscious of that. So I've had conversations with emerging leaders, and we've had this talk about, dress code and how should I dress. And we want to encourage people to be themselves and to be individuals. But at the same time, if I showed up to facilitate a session in my gym clothes, going back to the same example, Would people take me as seriously? Would people listen in the same way? Some might not. We do form our opinions based on what we see as well. So that's something that I always encourage people to choose what's comfortable for them. I don't like to be too restrictive for myself and for others, which then takes me to the army comment and, having my little army of Cecilias, which sounds like my husband's worst nightmare. But I think it's nice to have individuals who are accountable. That's really ultimately what I would like to see in my teams. I want to be challenged because I know I'm not always right. So I want to hear other ways of doing things. And I work with someone in my team who's very, very young. She's only recently graduated, and I love hearing her ideas because she brings a perspective that is different from mine. So I'm always very engaged when she shares, different ways of doing things, because I know that my way, although I've been lucky to work with lots of great companies that we partner with and learn from them, I know there's more to learn. So I think it's really important to give people the space to share and to be authentic. And everyone wants to be heard, seen, and respected ultimately. So I want that for myself. So I have to extend the same to others. So yes, having people who say yes and just do things sounds like a great thing, but that's not really what I'm looking for. And I think in most cases, most teams, you need that diversity of thought, because otherwise you're not really going to innovate and you're not really going to move forwards. So I would always encourage people to work with people who are different from themselves and who challenge them respectfully, even if it can be irritating at times. I think you need that. A little bit of conflict is the good thing.
And as much as we do want people showing up authentically in the workplace, it should be the curated version of your authentic self. It should be the best version of your authentic self. And if you're showing up for the first dinner, if you're dating someone and you're about to meet the parents of the person you're dating for the first time, you know that you want to show up to present yourself in a certain way. If you simply show up the way you wake up on a Saturday morning, probably not going to create the best impression. And you know that when you are applying for jobs, you want to show up authentically, but as the curated version of yourself, so that people do know you're paying attention to the details. I interviewed a young man who was absolutely very much a hipster, very alternative. He had tattoos that showed visible tattoos, and I don't have a judgment over that. I don't have any tattoos. I didn't grow up in an environment where there were a lot of people with tattoos, so it was noticeable to me, and noticeable to the point where, like, there was a tattoo that showed up from his neck area, and because it was noticeable, I decided, okay, I'm going to ask. It's part of this, and I said, "Is there a story behind the tattoo?" Best question I could have asked, because there absolutely was a story about that, his tattoos, and he even his body art was curated, was thoughtful, and it was actually quite impressive. Not just that, but his hairstyle was unique, but definitely groomed. So it wasn't lazy, it wasn't haphazard. He had a very conscious desire to show up in a certain way that reflected his image of himself and who he wanted to be in the workplace. And that to me was fantastic. Now I've had other interviews with men and women who show up more, hate to use the word normal, but in their normalness, you notice, shirt's not ironed. Oh, you notice, the other little details where they are on autopilot, where, I don't think you were really paying attention to the fact that your shoes are scuffed, or that this is to these little details. And I think those are the things that we notice in people, that right or wrong, and it can create a wrong impression, but the impression gets created. So for emerging leaders particular, I think in addition to that leadership microscope that they're going to be under now, part of what comes along with that is you do have to dress the part. You do have to ask yourself, what message am I sending? And then curate that message. Decide, what message do I want to send? For me, and I can go overboard on these kinds of things because I tend to be a little obsessive sometimes. But it took me a long time to find the specific brand of white shirt that I would wear in virtual meetings, because I wanted a particular kind of white that is sort of crisp and shows up well, and a particular kind of shirt. It's actually a button down shirt without the button. It essentially has that look of a button down, but it's just, again, I'm going overboard, but I'm saying there was thought put into how that would look virtually, and how that would look in the real world. And I think in this world of lots of people showing up authentically, lots of people showing up differently, it's harder for leaders, because you have to know, ideally, you should know your people and know them well and know their stories. That's what they want. It's nice to have soldiers. It's nice just to be able to look out and say, march forward. But I even think if you're a leader of an organization of 300,000 people, when you are in an elevator and suddenly there's someone in the elevator who you've never met before, I'm not saying or thinking that you need to know their story, or you need to know them, or you need to ask them a bunch of questions, but there is something in your demeanor that will communicate whether you're the kind of person who does see people, or if you're the kind of person who doesn't see people, who just sees cogs in the system. And people pick up on those small details, and that person walks out of the elevator, maybe never having exchanged even a single word with you, walks out either with an impression that you're open, accessible, or the impression that you don't see them, and that they carry that through into their workplace. Now, maybe that's more subtle than most people want to think about, but I think it's true. I think it's true in terms of how we communicate with each other, consciously and unconsciously. You work with a lot of cultures. Any big cultural distinctions or differences that you have seen, whether it's South America, Europe, Asia, India, any parts of the world, any big distinctions that might surprise people or people might find unexpected?
I do notice some differences, but I want to go back and revisit one of the
Yeah.
things you were talking about, because when you were talking about being authentic but a curated version of yourself, we do lots of work with leaders to understand their personal brand, to really understand what they stand up for. And the work starts with yourself. Do you know yourself well enough? Do you know what message you want to share with the world? Have you thought that through, or are you just showing up and hoping something will happen? So in terms of personal care, appearance, whatever you want to call it, people are surprised sometimes that I've got piercings, and I do have a couple of tattoos. They have meaning, they have a story. They're not hugely visible, but these are things that I've chosen for myself and represent me. And I think sometimes people are a bit surprised. And going back to the cultural thing, first time I went to India, people noticed that I've got a nose stud, and they were like, "Oh, that's something that's way more popular in India." I didn't even know that it's on the left side as well. I had it done here in the UK, so there was no connection at all. It was just something decorative for me.
Oh, is there a left-right distinction with nose piercings?
Yes, and speaking to some of my colleagues in India, I realized that some of them get them as early as 8 years old, and here you wouldn't even dream of doing a nose piercing on a child. But again, it's a cultural thing and it's differences. And I find it all fascinating. Having come from Argentina myself, I notice some differences between Latin America and Europe. But even more so when I have the opportunity to work with Asia, I see more differences as well in terms of even some of the work we do, the sessions we deliver, the way people learn, the way leaders behave. There are lots of differences. And we could talk about this for hours because it's one of my favorite topics. But I think we need to, as leaders, we also need to be aware of this when we are working with dispersed teams. We have to be mindful of respecting their culture, respecting time zones. This is such a big thing for global companies, and we do lots of work helping them get the best out of dispersed teams. And going back to people feeling respected, are you really, asking them to work outside of office hours at unsociable times? How are you managing this? Is this something that's a one-off? Is this the expectation? And again, it goes back to role modeling. And as a leader, what sort of messages are you saying? If you send a message saying, I'm always working around the clock, then other people will think that that's the only way to be a leader, to become a leader. People are trying to copy you, intentionally or not, because that's the example they have. So if you model those behaviors, if you have lax boundaries, then people will learn to copy those. So as leaders, we have to be really thoughtful about these things. And sometimes we get so caught up in the day-to-day and getting tasks done that we forget that there are other things that people are also observing. So this is some of the, again, very different from culture to culture. I see in the US, for example, where you are, there's more of an expectation of people working very long hours. In Europe, people are a lot more strict in terms of a work-life balance. Some countries even more so. You mentioned Scandinavia. They've got a really great approach to work-life balance, but also countries like France, Germany, they are more regulated in terms of how many hours people can work. So I do see lots of differences from location to location.
Well, and I've been conscious that the teams that work for me, they are creative teams. We don't necessarily think of them as creatives because they aren't doing, video design. They're not doing graphic design. They're creating training programs. But there's a huge amount of creativity and thought leadership that I want brought to those programs. And so my approach in leading them, and some of them are based in the US, some are based in India, but my approach to all of them, all of these instructional designers, has been a collaborative approach, a give and take approach, because I don't want them just saying, oh, tell me your vision and let me execute your vision. I want them, if I have someone who is creating a program on personal branding, I want them to bring themselves to that as well. So I want there to be give and take. And so I had an interesting experience with that. Someone new came into the mix who was observing my team's interactions when I wasn't around, when I, like, as they were working with each other. And this is in the Indian culture, some challenging feedback got given, not to me directly, got given kind of sideways, and eventually came back to me that my team in India was, and I'll use the exact quote, too democratic. Meaning, too much sharing of thoughts, sharing of opinions, batting ideas back and forth. And I was initially amused and a little annoyed. And as I sort of traced this feedback back to the source, what I came to understand was that this person, this individual, had a view of how things should be, which was much more command and control, much more the answer should flow top down. And by the time you get to the front line of instructional design, it should just be execution, just meet the timelines, meet the delivery requirements. And so this person had very much a different mindset regarding how things should be. And then instead of, because in a command and control world, you don't deliver criticism up, you deliver it off to the side and maybe hope that it flows up, through some other channel. Long story short, it was a great opportunity to have an open dialogue and conversation about expectations of the workplace, because a quote democratic environment doesn't mean non-productive. It means you can be highly executional, you can be highly productive, you can get in fact, my team has been incredibly productive while also acknowledging the creativity, the contributions, bringing the full minds of my team to the projects, as opposed to them just bringing their fingers and arms and just typing on a keyboard to execute. Anyway, so something about what you said just reminded me of that story. Any other cultural extremes that have come to you or that you've observed? And if not, I was hoping to talk a little bit about women in the workplace and the challenges still today that women face. And even in talking about how women show up in terms of their dress, their grooming, physically, I think we still hold women to different standards than we hold to men. Fair or not, I think that tends to still be the reality today. For maybe it's generational, maybe it's the older generations. I'm not totally sure. But what's been your experience of that?
Okay, my experience. We did some work last year with one of our clients, and we did this VR experience where people got to a headset and they were a woman in a high role in tech. So a very male-dominated environment where women don't usually have these places, or at least that's what people suspect.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole experience was, for me as a woman, and for me as a woman in leadership, it was a bit of a reminder of some of the things that we go through. And it's sort of, we become desensitized to an extent because it's just what happens. But I think for the men, it was a bit of an eye-opener, because some of the little comments about, oh, are you going to work dressed like that? And dressed like that can be many things to many people. I like to dress in a way that represents me. I like to be playful with what I wear. I mean, today I'm being very demure for this, but I like color. I like different cuts, and I'm not really restricting myself to what is supposed to be acceptable in certain environments. Having said that, I'm not going to go and maybe facilitate a session in a miniskirt, but there are things that I allow myself to wear because I feel comfortable and I feel they're appropriate. Culturally, the idea of what's appropriate varies a lot, and I see this. There's more relaxed, more dressed countries. So, for example, some of the work that I do around Europe, some people show up. I find that in Eastern Europe, for example, women in particular tend to be really well dressed, and they will wear high heels and blazers when they come to the sessions. In other parts of the world, they tend to be more relaxed. So if I go, for example, to Germany, there's going to be people wearing jeans, and that's absolutely fine. And then if we go even further afield, and we were talking about, collaborating with people in India, there's also an expectation of what's deemed as appropriate and what sort of expectations there are in terms of clothes. So I think, again, bring it back to authenticity. What represents you? What's a curated version of yourself? What would you find acceptable if someone else was showing up in that way? I think it's really important to regulate but not fake. I think regulation is the key, finding that balance. I don't want to be caricature of myself. I don't want to be what people might expect. So I think it's important to understand what your boundaries are and play within those. That's how I like to see it. I've had conversations with facilitators who are women as well, and they've said to me, "Oh, when I'm delivering a session, I always wear trousers. I don't wear a skirt." I don't see the harm in wearing a skirt. The length of the skirt might be something that people might find questionable. So again, it's 2025, right? I don't
If
know.
you
Do we
go
want to
too
dictate?
far, even wearing trousers for some people, that's a no-no for a woman. Women in trousers. For again, if you let yourself be driven too crazy by what will people react to. Well, now again, it's that balance. It's curating yourself and being thoughtful about it. But I suppose I understand if I'm a facilitator, I'm going to be in front of the room. I want to know what the room's expectations are, and I want to be the least distracting possible because I want to focus on the learning. At the same time, I still want to show up as me, not as some caricature of what a facilitator should be or what a facilitator is expected to be. I think it's getting more complex as our world merges together, and it may be that this merging, this globalization, we were hearing about globalization in the 60s and 70s and the 80s and 90s, but in the world today, we're seeing the reality of it, where you have cultures converging. Europe doesn't look like Europe used to look like. The US doesn't look like the US used to look like. Now, Japan still looks to a large degree like Japan, except for the tourists, but that's because they're quite insular in terms of allowing immigration into the country. But for much of the rest of the world, you're seeing much more variation, and you're seeing even within native Indians, even within native Japanese, within native Chinese, within native Germans, you're seeing much more variety because people are taking their cues no longer just from what they see around them. They're taking their cues from media, from social media, and they're taking their cues from lots of different places. But there has been, because it's happened so rapidly, and I think you could look at lots of drivers of this: social media, smartphone access, 7/24, lots of drivers of this. It may be that these changes have occurred so rapidly that you're seeing somewhat of a pushback from some, not from everyone, maybe not even from the majority, but you're seeing pushback from people who feel like the world is changing too fast. The world is no longer the comfortable sweater that I used to wear. The world is now something different that doesn't feel comfortable. And so when we read about anti-diversity initiatives, anti-woke initiatives, anti-whatever, when we hear about the antis, I think the two big drivers of those antis are, number one, changes happen so fast. I haven't yet really internalized it and become comfortable. And number two, for many people, their own lives are not what they expected them to be. When you have broadly throughout the world people who aren't achieving the level of economic comfort that they expected at this time in their lives. If people are economically uncertain, economically uncomfortable, and then the world seems to be changing so rapidly, you can understand this instinct for pushing back, this instinct for let's go back to the way things were. Whether it makes sense or not, whether it's right or not, I think understanding the instinct at least gives me a little more empathy when I deal with someone, and I still do. I deal with plenty of leaders who will say, the good old days, it used to be like this. And they'll talk about change and the changing work environment almost with a longing for, I wish things were this way. And I don't want to just push back at them. I want to have empathy for how they are feeling. But I think throughout the world, and tell me if this is true from your point of view, the world is changing more quickly than a lot of people are comfortable everywhere. It's not just the West. It's not just the West or the East. It's really broadly everywhere, even to the point, take the most insular environments you can imagine. I traveled to Saudi Arabia 25 years ago. Very insular then. And you travel to Saudi today, and it's definitely not Norway. It's not, but it's also not the Saudi Arabia of 25 years ago. So change is coming everywhere, but it's also making some people very, very uncomfortable because of the rapidity of that change. I don't know. Does that prompt any thoughts?
Yes, change is one of the topics that we talk about the most in leadership sessions. It's definitely a hot topic. The thing with change is inevitable, right? That's the only constant is change, but it destabilizes people, and it threatens our safety and our perception of ourselves. So some of the things you were describing, I was thinking, well, that comes out of fear. We're afraid of the uncertain, of the unknown. So fear is what makes people reluctant to change or resent change. So fear is one of the main things. And the other thing is sometimes lack of confidence, and even lack of confidence in yourself. How are you going to cope with the change? What's my role going to be? And when we talk about change, I feel like I need to talk about AI. I didn't really have it on my agenda, but when we talk about change, this is another thing that's making people nervous. And even if we look back to 3 years ago, not even that far, how that's grown so rapidly and how it's really changing the workplace so much. This is change that you either embrace or you're left behind. So how do we then equip our workforce to really make the best use out of change? Because change is not stopping. So you either get on the train or you just watch it go past. So yeah, change is, and then when we think of change, we think of, the emotional impact of change, of the practicalities of change, of resilience. How do we then cope with the new normal? What do we learn? What do we improve from the lessons that we've learned from the past? I don't know. I quite like change. I don't
Man,
really
you bring
long
up
for the good old days, because I think, these are good days, and the future has plenty of good days that we haven't yet seen. So I'm quite optimistic when it comes to change, maybe naively so, but I'm
so
okay with
this convergence of AI and authenticity. So we've, in talking about both of these things, I think you are so right. We're still figuring out. We are in the midst of figuring out how do we leverage AI as a tool without losing ourselves in it. And you have some people who have definitely taken it to the point where they've lost. How do I say this? I noticed a leader who sent a weekly message out to his team, and it went out every week. I think it was Monday afternoons every week. It was sort of a weekly status meeting. His team noticed when suddenly the messages became longer, flatter, less compelling, but more, quote, professional. It's like the team noticed, and they all said, "Oh, he's either using ChatGPT or he's using Claude or he's using something." And what was lost was the raw authenticity of, because what he used to do was simply think back, okay, what happened this last week? What were the highs? What were the lows? What did we accomplish? What did we learn? He had a way of communicating that was authentically him, and it might not have been perfect. He would occasionally make spelling errors, make grammar errors, but that was him, and it was relatively brief. Basically, he wrote as much as his attention span would allow him to write. So you'd sit down maybe for 10 minutes and write the message and send it out. No more thought. You take that message now and you put it into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT would professionalize his communication, would smooth it out, would lengthen it, and it became a longer read, a less authentic read. But and the reason this came to me is one of his team members was sharing this situation where they had now for several months, they basically stopped reading the messages because they would come in and they were just too long. It didn't feel like a message from him anymore. And so I said to this person who shared this situation with me, well, have you said anything? Well, no, how do you say that? Because I don't know. I suspect, but I don't know. And I said, well, this is probably a situation where you're not really doing right by that person by not having the conversation. So he doesn't know that it's like someone coming to a public function and having a piece of broccoli in their teeth, and you're talking about it sideways, but you're not actually saying to them, hey, by the way, we can all kind of see this piece of broccoli stuck in your tooth. So it was a really good example of how AI was actually reducing authenticity. Now, there is a way, I'm not saying that person should never use AI, but there are ways to use AI where you make sure that AI is simply helping you curate the best version of you, curate your communication. So this is, in fact, the best version of you. So you eliminate any, spelling errors and grammar errors. And sometimes it might include some wordsmithing that would not have occurred to you otherwise. But I think that's a new skill. Many leaders are just on the cusp of understanding what does AI do. It's almost like we've given these tools without much forethought or foresight, without much training. And so, you give a bow and arrow to a 6-year-old, expect that there's going to be some damage if you don't go through some training. And I think that's what we've done is we've given these tools without a lot of foresight and training, and then we're surprised when there's a bit of damage. What say you, Cecilia Anderson?
Well, I feel like we keep coming back to this. It's always like an elevated or curated version of yourself. And I think with AI and the way I use AI, and I use AI a lot, don't probably not as much as some people, but probably more than the average person. I don't know where I am on the scale, but I always make sure that rather than saying, write a message about this, I tend to write the message myself and then say, coach me or elevate this and, show me improvements. And I use this as a tool for self-development. And I think that's what really keeps my voice mine, because I don't want to lose myself and become just something that's generic, a generic AI message. And we know what the generic AI messages look like. We know the sentences. We know the use of end dashes. We see this. So I can sniff it from a distance because, there's the telltale signs. So I will use AI to enhance something that I write, because why not, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to make my life easier or help me maybe tailor it to a certain audience. So thinking of the example you were sharing, if I was that leader sharing a message, I would think, okay, how much detail do I need to share with my team? And even especially if you're writing the other way around, for example, if you're writing a message to a CEO, you know that you need to go straight to the point, you need to give facts, and, how can you tailor your message to the audience? And that's where AI can be really helpful. But I still want it to be my message.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm just too precious about my message. I don't know. I feel that I want my voice to be my voice. And if AI gives me an output that I feel doesn't sound like me, I will challenge it, because they're learning, right? It's learning from your prompts. So I'm very thoughtful when it comes to my prompt engineering, and then I will challenge it if I think something is not me or is not what I deem as correct. Then recheck your facts, make it more like me. That's something I would never say. Don't use that language. So yeah, you don't want to see my
I don't think
you don't really want
you're
to
being too precious at all. I think that in the same way that we guard our authenticity, we curate our authenticity, and I think it's particularly important to younger generations of workers, but it's not that it's not important to others. I guess what I've seen is more mature workers grew up in a work environment that didn't give them permission to be themselves. So that in some ways they're still operating with old habits. Like, but then I would ask them, would you go to a suit tailor? And when the tailor says, hey, what kind of suit would you like? Would you say to the tailor, well, I want to look like everybody else. I want to not be noticed. Create a suit for me that makes me invisible. You would not.
Well,
You'd
some
not do
people
that.
might want that. I'm not
Well,
one of those
some might.
people.
Okay. So, and if that is truly what you want, then absolutely leverage AI and ask AI, make this perfect and bland and invisible, because I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to take a chance on offending anyone. If that's the case, okay, yes, that would be the most authentic thing that you could do, because that's what you want to do. But I think for most of us, particularly younger workers, we want a voice. We want to be seen. We want something about even the simplest email that you're sending out to your team. You want something about it that says, this is you. Hello, world. Here I am. And as leaders, if we operate that way, we are giving permission to the people who report to us. If I'm unique, if I come to the work environment as a distinct human being, and I'm comfortable expressing how I am distinct, I'm giving permission to others to do the same thing. And if I'm too tightened it down, if I'm too controlled, if I'm too perfect, I think unfortunately I may be sending a message out to others that, hey, what I expect is bland perfection. And at least in my world. Now, it might be different if I was an engineer and we were building nuclear reactors. I might have a heightened sense of compliance and rigidity, possibly, but because I'm in a world of creatives who are thought leaders and are building training, maybe that's why my sensitivity is the way that it is. But I think even nuclear engineers deserve a little bit of permission to show up uniquely in the workplace.
I agree with you, and I think we spend most of our waking hours in work. And I know, sorry if I brought this thought to your mind, but we spend so much time in work. Do I want to be faking it all the time? I think this is really important. I've got a friend who's interviewing for jobs currently, and we were having this conversation about really having a connection with the people that you work with. And for me, this is super important. And when I interview people, when I meet people to join my team, I always think, okay, what other layers are there to you? What should I know about you? Because I want to really understand the individual and to really see what they bring. And if someone says to me, oh, I just work and this is all I do, it might be true. And, I respect that. But at the same time, I want someone who's going to have something that makes them passionate, a purpose, something else that drives them. And I really want to peel some of those layers and get to know the individual. When you were introducing me, you were saying that I ask lots of questions. I do ask lots of questions. Anyone who spent any length of time in my presence, I am very curious, and I always will ask questions about people's lives, because I just want to know what drives them, what inspires them. I think I need to feel that with people. And if you're not being authentic, then you're not bringing those things to the table. And for me, it's about going back to some of the other topics we discussed, cultural differences and the way people see the world. And those are the things that make what we do much richer. I don't want to work with cloned versions of me. I don't want people to, some people might think I'm just saying this, but I don't want people to agree with me all the time. I want to be shown different ways. I want to be able to learn from others. So this is where variety and diversity will come into play. But we need to be ourselves, and we need to be our curated best version of ourselves. So yeah, that's sort of my overall message for today.
And you and I come from very different cultural heritages and backgrounds. We come from very different worlds. We would have lots of reasons for not really connecting as people, but in fact, almost from the beginning, when I first met you, I felt so much a kinship with you, and I've thought about it, and I think a lot of it was you are so comfortable in your own skin. You are so comfortable being who you are authentically. And to your point, you ask a lot of questions. You are so interested in other people. You ask great questions, and the questions do not feel like an interrogation. They just feel like genuine interest and curiosity. And that worked for me. I just felt like from the beginning, I like this person. I feel comfortable with this person, and it's been great. The more we get to know each other, I think it just strengthens that bond. But that bond was there pretty quickly from the beginning. Now, I will say I spent the first 2/3 of my adult working life, whenever I would apply for a job, and let me just say, I have applied for plenty of jobs. I have had lots of, you can call them opportunities, you can call them whatever you want to call them, but I've applied for plenty of jobs. And I spent the first 2 years of my life focusing on, what do I need to be to get the job? What do I need to present? What dance do I need to dance? What words do I need to say? Putting on the best possible show. And there came a point in my life, and I remember the first time I went into a job interview, and I had arrived at a certain point in my life where I just said, I mostly want to know about them. I want to know, I don't want to work for a jerk again. I don't want to work for an environment, or in an environment that doesn't resonate with me. Now, it helped that in this particular interview, I, I, I had a job that I was okay with. I wasn't running away from anything. So I was pretty, comfortable in my life, and it put me in a place where I could show up just as me. Now, I still, I dressed well. I did all the things that one would do for a job interview. But I was so focused on them, and whether or not I would connect with them. And from that point, where I became really comfortable in my own skin, it's so interesting that the interviews, when I have had them, have gone incredibly well. And yet occasionally I do identify individuals. I just don't. I'm going to choose to not work with you. It's just not. It's not that you're bad. It's just there's not a fit, and I feel much more comfortable making that call. And so, finding that way to be that authentic version of yourself, that curated, authentic version of yourself that connects with other people, being comfortable in your own skin. I think it's a subtle set of skills that, if one is going to be a global leader, dealing with multiple cultures, multiple generations, multiple work environments, I think you have to start with that personal comfort. Who am I? Who am I? And why am I doing what I do? And then you have to set yourself, because if you think you're just going to be a reflection, an echo of this culture, then this environment, then this person, if you're nothing but an echo, I think it'll drive you crazy. What do you think?
And you're never going to get it right.
Right. Yes.
Because
Absolutely.
the only thing you can get right is be true to yourself, and you're, protecting your energy, setting boundaries, anchoring yourself to your purpose. What's your legacy? What are you trying to build here? So the only way that I can get this right is if I focus on myself and how I want to show up. If I'm trying to second guess what other people expect, it's never going to work. So,
and then if you have a few good friends around you, a few, close family members who know you well, they may occasionally come to you and say, hey, this particular aspect of the authentic version of yourself needs a bit of attention. And I've had those conversations where someone has said, here's an element of how you tend to show up. And I had someone say, when you disagree with what someone's saying, it shows on your face immediately. You have a face that shuts people down. They literally said those words, your look shuts people down. And I can't recreate it for you here, but there's a certain seriousness that comes when someone starts talking and my brain is thinking, what you're saying makes absolutely no sense. And I get very serious. And the person who was talking to me said, it's not wrong, but I just want you to know how transparent it is. And so when I recognize that, I change my internal dialogue, because I know that if I just focus on the debate, you've said something that I disagree with, and I'm going to prepare my next debate talking point, that puts my face in a certain place. If instead I'm saying to myself, let's explore how somebody could be thinking about this so differently than you are thinking. Somebody equally smart, equally aware, but they see it very, very differently. Let's explore that. My eyes or something about my face goes to a different place. So we can, that authentic version of ourselves can also evolve over time, if we have enough self-awareness and if we're open to it, I think.
I feel seen, Dan. When you were saying that, I could hear the voices of the people who love me and said, your face, you need to control your face. Your face is giving too much away. So I definitely can relate. And it would be very sad if the authentic, curated version of ourselves didn't evolve, because it means we've learned nothing through the years. So I want to keep evolving, and I want to keep working on the next version of myself, and competing with myself, as I like to see it. I'm always trying to think, okay, what was I like 5 years ago? How have I improved? What can I do next? And yeah, maybe that's a me thing, but I'm always thinking of, what have I learned along the way? I like to do daily reflections, weekly reflections, and think of, and again, you can use AI for this. You can log different things, and then, what have I learned from these lessons? What are the main points? There are so many ways you can do this.
I will love it when AI eventually evolves to the point where I can upload a recording of a meeting and ask AI, give me some feedback on how I showed up at that meeting. Because I've done that exact exercise with close associates, people whose instinct I trust, and you can get some really great feedback. But so far, at least, I've not experienced that with AI.
Well, the risk with AI here is that AI will tell you what you want to hear.
Yeah.
It's a bit too complimentary, I would say. I prefer a bit of, tough love sometimes. I think I learned from that better than from the compliments.
Sure.
But yes, you can do that. There are ways to get feedback. But I like to think of every session I deliver, I'm always thinking, okay, as much as I get feedback from the participants, I'm always trying to think of feedback for myself. And, maybe that example that I used wasn't the best one. Maybe that didn't land very well. Maybe I didn't position that in the best way. So I'm always thinking of the next curated version of myself and what that could look like.
Especially if I could have phrased that better. And then you ask AI, and AI says, "Fantastic, great job," or it gives you some feedback that's definitely off track. I want to be respectful of your time, Cecilia, and as we're close to wrapping up, there was just something you just said a moment ago prompted a thought, and I guess I'm going to decide that thought's not going to go unshared. As we evolve, some of us, I'll say myself included, have a tendency then to look back on our lives and say, oh, I wish the 25-year-old me knew that. And then beat up on ourselves for what we did, when we were 25 or 30 or whatever age. And I would just suggest that as you evolve, have some empathy for your younger self. Your younger self was doing the best you could do with what you had at the time. And that's part of how you grow, is not to beat up on your younger self, but to just, in fact, embrace your younger self and then continue to grow and evolve. And I think that is the path toward mentally healthy evolution, as opposed to just beating up on yourself. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think sometimes, we can be our own worst critics, and it's important to acknowledge that without the mistakes that we made, earlier in our career or in our lives even, we wouldn't be where we are today. So I needed to learn those lessons, and and I'm sorry. And I think when we look at it from a leadership perspective, the decisions that we make and the way we communicate, the choices we make, they impact other people. So I always think, I apologize to the people who had me at my worst 20 years ago or so. I do apologize if anyone's watching this, but I needed to learn those lessons so that I can be a bit better now. And we have to forgive ourselves and just focus on learning and growing. That's
So
all we
thank
can
you
do.
for that. And let me say, as we wrap up, the overarching intent of this podcast is to, it's somewhat selfish, is to provide me an opportunity to meet and discuss these kinds of things with a broad range of people, just as a way of continuing to deepen my understanding of what's changing in the workplace landscape, what's changing in leadership, what's evolving in leadership. And so when I have conversations like this one with you right now, it's hugely rewarding, and it validates the value for me of having these kinds of conversations, because I come away with new knowledge, with new awareness. And it's also just kind of enjoyable because you are cool. You are a cool person to have a conversation like this with. So I thank you for that. For those who want a little more information about Cecilia Anderson, I'll make sure we include in the show notes your LinkedIn, connection and how to find out more information about you. Any final thoughts?
You're one compliment away from sounding like AI.
All right. I won't go overboard.
No, but
Then.
thank you so much, Dan. I always enjoy talking to you. So thank you for having me as a guest today.
Thank
We've
you.
basically recorded one of our conversations.
Yeah, that's
One of
exactly
the
it.
many
We've just
conversations
taken
we've
a
had.
conversation that we would normally have had over a cup of cappuccino, and we've recorded it, and we'll see how the world responds to that conversation. So thank you, Cecilia. We'll talk again soon.
My
Bye-bye.
pleasure. Thank you so much.